It was a dark and stormy night. I know that sounds like a bad horror movie, but it's true. It was late at night, and a thunder and electrical storm raged outside. For a week, I'd been house-sitting at an old manor house on the edge of town. The owners were expected back the next day, but that night, the night of the storm, I was alone. You see, I was a student, so house-sitting was a way to make extra money, plus get out of the noisy dorm. The quiet was usually welcoming. Except for this night. I'd been curled up on the sofa, watching an old movie, when the grandfather clock struck midnight. Almost on cue, the power went out. Great. It had been flickering all night, so I guess I shouldn't have been surprised. Before they left, the owners shared where their emergency kit was with me, because they said they often had outages, being such an old house, and being so far away from the grid. The kit was on a shelf in the pantry next to the salt. The box held a big flashlight, candles and matches, an older battery-operated radio, and a first aid kit were also in the box. Did I mention the salt? I didn't understand at the time. I just thought it was weird. I was told to take the salt and pour a line around the perimeter of the property every second day. I remember thinking they must have some hell of a slug problem, but I dutifully did what I was requested. Okay, where was I? Oh yeah, the power was out, but I was all alone in a creepy old house on the edge of town. Even the street lights on the block were out, so it was dark. I could see the glow of lights probably a few blocks over, but my area was dark. I took the box into the front room and lit the candles, placing them around the room. The immediate glow was comforting, but it was still so quiet. The pendulum clicking from the old grandfather clock echoed around the room as it swung back and forth. Thunder boomed outside, shaking the windows. Well, I guess it wasn't that quiet. I took the radio out of the box and turned it on. Static crackled. The batteries worked. I turned the dial until a station came on. Talk radio. But at least it was another voice. The announcer talked about the bad weather, even did the same dark and stormy night joke that I did earlier. The news announcer stopped speaking, then started again over a rustle of paper. "This just in," he said. "After killing a nurse and a doctor, Devin McGreen has escaped from the Caledonia State Mental Institute. He is considered armed and dangerous. Police are asking all citizens to remain indoors with your doors and windows locked. Do not approach. I repeat, Devin McGreen is armed and dangerous and at large." Fan-freaking-tastic. I always had doors and windows locked because, well, girl alone, but I figured it best to double check. So, with my flashlight in hand, I moved through the house, making sure the house was secure. I found one window in the den unlocked that I was quite certain I'd locked earlier, but maybe I'd missed it. I locked it. I looked out of the window, and that's when I saw him. A man standing underneath a big oak tree, just on the other side of the fence. I stepped behind the curtain so he couldn't see me, but I think he did. He was looking straight at the house, in my direction. A lightning bolt cracked overhead, drawing my attention upward for a brief moment. When I looked back at the tree, the man was gone. I looked up and down the street. Gone. Just gone. I suppose if I were out in that storm, I'd hoof it fast too, but it still gave me the chills. I returned to the front room and eyed the fireplace. I'd never started a real fire before, but it was chilly, so I was willing to give it a try. I put some smaller pieces of wood into the fireplace, crumpled some paper, and lit it with a match from the kit. Flames slowly spread over the kindling, and as the fire took hold, I laid on a small log, followed by a larger one. I leaned back on my heels to admire my handiwork. It was burning. The front room had a nice glow, and heat, glorious heat, spread slowly from the hearth. I got up to sit on the sofa again and maybe try to read something. I thought I'd take a look out the window first. All seemed okay except for the sound of rain, which seemed pretty loud. But the sound wasn't coming from the front window. It was further away, like in another room. Weird. But I decided to check it out. As I got closer to the kitchen, the sound got louder, and I could feel a cool breeze. I entered the kitchen to find the window above the sink wide open. I stood there for a second. I know I closed and locked that window. Nothing seemed out of place, though, so I crossed the room, closed and locked it again. Then, just to be sure, I figured I'd better check the pantry, which was just to the right of the window. It was the only place somebody could hide in the kitchen. I grabbed the meat tenderizer from the utensil holder. You know, those things that look like a hammer, has the little pokey thing on one side so as to tenderize the meat? Yeah, one of those. It was all I had for a weapon. Anyway, I tipped over to the pantry door with the meat tenderizer raised and ready to strike and flung it wide. The pantry was just as empty as it was when I retrieved the emergency kit not that long ago. I stepped inside and looked right and left. Nope, definitely empty. I closed the door and turned to go back through the kitchen to the living room. My head swiveled back to the knife block on the counter. A knife was missing. And wet footsteps led away and down the hall. Oh, shit. Someone was in the house with me. And that someone had a knife. I edged along the wall, being as quiet as I could until I reached the telephone on the wall. Now remember, folks, this was a couple decades ago, before cell phones were even a thought. I picked up the receiver, but there was no dial tone. It was dead. Not only was the power out, so were the phones. I gave another look at the footprints, but they were gone. I mean, there were still a few wet spots, but the actual marks seemed to have dried up already. Had I imagined it? I took another glance toward the knife block. No, a knife was still missing. I was still alone with a crazed killer. Rain be damned, I ran to the front door, determined to make a run for it. I twisted the doorknob and tugged at the door, but nothing happened. It wouldn't open. Oh yeah, the lock. In my panic, I'd forgotten to unlock the door. I pushed the bolt back again and turned the doorknob. But still, the door wouldn't open. I pulled again and again. This wasn't good. There was a back door off the kitchen, so I went there. The backyard was darker than the front, but at this point, I didn't care. Whatever was out there was far better than what was in here. But again, the door wouldn't open. Double shit. Okay. He must have gone down the hall and upstairs, judging by the direction of footprints, but I couldn't hear anything. He was being very quiet. I tiptoed back to the living room. It was the only place where I could close off the front room to separate me from him. It was an older house, so there were always doors between different areas, to kind of maintain warmth and stuff. And this area had a door that separated the front room from the rest of the house. It was usually left wide open, but I decided to close it. A small window in the door was there to see who was on the other side. I suppose to prevent you from slamming into someone if you were going to open it. The floorboards overhead creaked, and footsteps seemed to thunder through the house. Of course, that could have just been my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, but I still couldn't help looking up at the ceiling with my breath stuck in my throat. The sound stopped, and I miraculously started breathing again. There was no lock on the door, so I found a chair in the study and carried it back to the front room. Thankfully, the door opened inward, so I pushed the back of the chair under the door handle and stepped back. And screamed bloody blue murder. There he was on the other side of the door, grinning maniacally at me. He licked the glass and raised the knife so I could see it as he tried opening the door. The chair held. He stepped out of my line of vision. God, where did he go? I had no weapons to defend myself if he got in, and I couldn't get out the doors. I thought frantically of what I'd seen in the house. Did I remember a baseball bat hanging on the wall in the study? I went there. Yeah, there it was. That could be helpful for any, close encounters if I swung hard enough. Seriously, though, I wasn't very big. Could I fend off a crazy man with a knife? Really? For a minute, maybe. I looked around the study, no way in except for the window and the door. The window was locked because I did that a while ago and double-checked it twice. The door was sturdy. heavier than that one with the window separating me from the killer. I closed it and, oh my God, it had a lock. I locked it. Okay, I was staying in the study, barricaded by 2 doors. Thunder continued to crash outside as rain pummeled the house. The only light in the study came from the lightning that lit up the sky. I was terrified. I checked the phone on the desk again, just maybe. Maybe by some miracle it would work. No, still no dial tone. A loud crash sounded. I stood stark still and listened. I think he just broke through the front room door. Heavy footprints crossed the floor toward the study. I gulped hard and held the baseball bat in front of me. After several heart-pounding moments, the lights came back on. Oh, thank God. I rushed to the phone and was greeted by a dial tone. I quickly dialed 911 and told the operator that there was an armed intruder in the house. She told me to stay put, that she was dispatching police immediately and to stay on the phone with her until they arrived. I wasn't sure if I could hear him over the sound of the radio and now the TV sounding in the background. I wanted to put my ear up to the door for a good listen. But I've seen way too many movies where the killer smashed his knife through the door and got the dumbass who'd done that. I wasn't going to be one of those. It seemed like forever before I heard the sirens and saw the flash of red and blue light up the drive. That's when I was the most afraid. Anything could happen between now and when the police came inside. Oh no. I almost cried out loud. To let them in the door, I'd have to leave the safety of the den. I'd have to unlock the door and walk through the front room where that killer was and open the outside door. That's it. That's how I was going to die. A rap at the window shattered my thoughts, and I screamed as I turned around. It was a policeman knocking on the window with the butt of his flashlight. I let out a huge breath and almost ran to the window, unlatched it, and stepped aside as he came through. "Are you all right?" he asked me. I assured him I was fine, scared but fine. "Is the intruder still in the home?" I shrugged. I honestly didn't know. I think so," I replied. He took a knife from the kitchen. He nodded and motioned me back as he approached the door. Drawing his sidearm, he raised it and turned the lock, quickly opening the door. He looked left and then right, then advanced slowly into the front room, his weapon at the ready. He quickly crossed to the front door and unlocked it, admitting the other responding officers. Motioning them in, they began to silently search the house in pairs, 2 downstairs to the basement, 2 on the main level, 2 up the stairs to the upper level. 1 stayed with me outside on the porch. It was funny. Standing out on the porch with an armed police officer was almost worse than being locked inside with a madman all evening. I kept expecting to hear screams or scuffles or gunshots, but there was nothing. Just silence as the officers went through the house room by room. Then, finally, they returned to the porch. There was no one in the house. He'd gotten away somehow. More lights came up the drive. As the 2 people got out of the taxi, I recognized them as my employers, the owners of the house. They glanced between each other as they took in the police cars with lights flashing, the group of men standing on the porch, still with guns drawn. "What's going on here?" Mr. Brown asked. It all came out in a rush as I filled him in on the night's events. One of the policemen started talking about a search party. Mr. Brown held up his hand. "Don't. It isn't necessary." I think we all looked at him like he'd sprouted another head. Mrs. Brown chimed in. "There wasn't really anyone here, Jen." She ignored my look of incredulousness and continued. "We never told you. Many of the people in this town know this house, know its history. That's why we insisted on salt." At this point, we had all quieted to listen. What she was saying was kind of crazy. "You see, many, many years ago, this house wasn't a family home. It was an asylum for the criminally insane, a mental institution. One of its most famous inmates was a man named Devin McGreen." That's the guy," I said. "The guy from the news alert on the radio." "What news alert?" one of the policemen asked. "There wasn't any news alerts tonight, just a lot of weather alerts." "No, I heard it. He escaped, and the news guy said to lock all the windows and doors because—" "Let's go inside, shall we?" Mr. Brown cut me off and waved his arm toward the door. "This is going to sound a bit strange, but we can explain." Years ago, Devin McGreen was convicted of murdering a bunch of people at a hospital not far from here. It's gone now, torn down decades ago, Mrs. Brown started. He was housed here at the Caledonia State Mental Institute. My knees shook as I lowered myself to one of the chairs in the front room. That's the institute where he had escaped from. That's what they said on the news. One night, there was a horrible thunderstorm, like tonight. The building lost power, and somehow he escaped from his cell. On the way out, he murdered several staff members. To this day, on rainy nights, his ghost is often seen standing outside the property line, under that big tree out there, watching. Nobody really knows why, except maybe he wants to come home. I gasped. I saw him. Then he was gone, and I didn't know where he went. The salt is very important, which is why we insist on having it poured around the property every second day. It keeps ghosts, the bad ghosts, away. They can't cross the boundary. But if the salt is all washed away, then there's nothing stopping him from returning. What you saw and experienced was Devin McGreen's ghost. He couldn't have hurt you. He isn't real. I shook my head. He was real enough to leave footsteps, and real enough to grab a knife from the butcher's block and crash that door in. I pointed to the door to the kitchen. It wasn't off its hinges or broken in any way. What? I hurried toward the kitchen. All the knives were accounted for in the butcher's block. I returned and picked up the radio. It was playing music. No talk radio. I looked up at her. I don't understand. The radio. All part of the same phenomenon, I'm afraid, Mr. Brown said. Another police officer cleared his throat. Well, if it's all the same to you, we're going to search the neighborhood anyway, just to be sure everything is safe. But I'm going to give my sergeant a call. He might be able to corroborate what you've just said. He's been here a lot longer than I have. Tipping his head, he motioned for the rest of the officers to leave with him. The Browns exchanged glances again. The regular salt won't do for tonight. It'll just wash away. I'm going to go put a big line of that rock salt we've got in the basement. That should hold until morning. Rain should be over by then. Yes, dear, Mrs. B said. She turned to me. Let's go make a nice cup of hot tea. It looks like you could use one. I nodded in agreement. Turning back to look over my shoulder, I looked out toward the big picture window. Under the tree, there was a large shadow of a man, watching. I blinked and caught my breath, looked again. He was gone.